thunder rumbled in the sky, though not from any storm anyone could see. It almost felt as though the mountains themselves trembled at the foreign invaders. A strange sort of hum filled the air. Orange and red lightning punctuated it with thunder as the haze continued to thicken. The first revenants appeared over the horizon. They moved at a steady pace, tumbling trees like wheat before the thresher's shaft. Aged oaks and pines went down with a little effort as kicking a pebble. Courtney's group was the closest to the initial outburst. With a cry of defiance, she set her teams against the first scouts. Dragons launched into the air, their riders wielding projectiles of natural composition. Some carried pine cones they ignited midair, much like Courtney had weeks before. Others shot charged projectiles of electricity at the disjointed creatures. Their efforts seemed of little use, at least until the ground crews began to distract their foes with their attacks. Since these revenants didn't seem able to fly, it helped a lot. The ground teams used anything and everything at their disposal. Some of their weapons came from fragmented wood smoothed into shafts. These they used to stab through the tough hide of most creatures. Other weapons included rocks thrown like ballast from a catapult. Their aim was not so much to hit, but to divert, and for the most part, it seemed to work. One dragon swooped in. His rider held an elongated bone blade ready to score the closest revenant. The blade traced a red line up from the midsection to the chin before the creature was able to react. They barely managed to dive out of the way in time to avoid being swatted out of the sky by a gnarled claw.
Right flank!
Courtney ordered from her perch. Since she wasn't riding a dragon, she opted to help with ground support. She managed to find a decent-looking splinter of wood and asked it to transform to her needs. Then, with a mighty heave, the blonde launched it into the sky. The projectile sped towards the injured revenant. It dug deep into the gash the dragon and his rider had opened. All around her, other crews focused on their respective targets. There were 6 in total, dividing their attention. Thankfully, they had at least 2 teams per revenant. But even with that support, the twisted semblance of dragons didn't want to go down. One of the first groups focused on the revenant Courtney had wounded. They pounded the wooden spear deeper and deeper into the obsidian flesh. As the creature fell to the ground, those nearest it began slashing it apart with bone knives and staves. It didn't go quietly, but no one died from the encounter. Unfortunately, the other 5 gave them more trouble. Even though these revenants were of the lesser variety, they were faster than anticipated. A few dragons were swatted from the sky. Of those who lay stunned, one was too injured to continue. His rider died from being crushed underneath the massive body when they fell. When Courtney saw a riderless dragon, she hailed it and expertly swept onto the ridge's back. And, in a way, it was almost like riding a spiky horse, something she'd learned to do as a child. As the dragon's wings pushed them high into the sky, she let out a low exclamation. Over 100 revenants of varying sizes were headed in their direction. Their ranks formed some kind of semicircle, and behind them, even more revenants waited to join the fray. If the mage was any judge of warfare, she'd be more than willing to bet those they faced first were more foot soldiers, and those hanging back had the real power. It was possible they hoped the others would wear down their enemies before joining in. If so, she thought it likely to work. They'd only just begun, and her small group was already ready for a break. A second revenant went down as 3 teams of dragons scored it with their claws. It stumbled into a third that stood too close. The ground crews made short work of them, leaving 3 more in the immediate threat. Courtney didn't want to abandon her forces, but she knew she needed to get the word out. With only some misgiving, she urged her dragon to head towards the ruined city and the others. If they weren't on their guard now, they needed to be. Leslie felt Courtney's presence overhead before she heard her. The warning the younger mage called out about the incoming revenants made her blood run cold. She pulled her headgear into place. Each of her group had some form of armor they'd brought with them. It left them more prepared than their sister mages. But it couldn't be helped. They'd had longer to prepare. The thunderous sound of giant feet filled the air. There was no time for comments. The trees around them shattered as though frozen and dropped from great height. Black and dark brown figures emerged. Some came on land while others came from the air as they converged on the mages before them. From there it became difficult to tell what was going on. Inhuman cries filled the air every time one of the revenants became injured, but even more cries of pain filled the air from the mages as they fought to hold them back. More than a few fell to the earth, incapacitated as their foe pressed forward.
Let's go!
Leslie rallied her people. Sarah, her second, commanded another group, hoping to catch the enemy in a pincer maneuver. The two groups converged on those in their path. From there, they cut them down with weapons forged from wood and steel. More screams filled the air as more mages went down, taking revenants with them. Above, fire erupted in the sky as Walter set off bottle rockets. Most didn't think the fireworks a formidable weapon, but the colorful streaks of fire seemed to cause some damage. With the veteran's aim, they were more than devastating to those he aimed for. The mages harnessed the fire to forge new weapons, hoping to cut the revenants down. Some of the creatures went down in a hail of fiery projectiles expertly launched. Others, larger in size, didn't want to go down quite so easily. Once more, Leslie released a rallying cry, her people answering in kind. Flames threatened to overwhelm the ground. She used her skills to push the worst of them towards the enemy, creating more space for the mages to fight in. Part of her attention became diverted a bit as the location of the flying rockets changed. Walter wasn't staying in one place. Wished she couldn't help but applaud. She really hoped he'd make it through all of this. She didn't even bother to contemplate the possibility that she might not.
Charge!
She called out again, bone sword in hand as she tackled the nearest imposter dragon with her fury. Horns sounded and Anwen shuddered at the sound that followed. The screams were hard to ignore, but she tried. She wielded the crystal sword. After having defeated Kira, she knew the blade had special properties. She was more than willing to use them if possible. However, those nearest her refused to let her down into the battle. She bounced on antsy feet as those below her were either slaughtered or injured. She should be down there helping them out. Just how long had it been since Courtney had flown over, calling out her warning? She had no idea. It felt like an eternity. Overhead, dragons and revenants clashed like boulders. Lightning continued to flash across the sky. It was possible the true demons had brought it with them. That or the mountain was trying to fight back in its own way. Anwen didn't stop to think which might be the truth. At the urging of those few mages charged to look after her, she dodged falling chunks of revenant. They fell and rolled like cannonballs that had lost momentum mid-launch. The devastation was no less for that. The chunks smashed anything and everything in their path. One mage somehow fell in front of one of the falling chunks, only to be crushed by it as it rolled in her direction. Anwen let out a scream of anguish. This was all so senseless. Why couldn't these two entities get along? She had no answers, and so the tears flowed down her cheeks. Part of her wanted to just blow them all away, but she heeded the words of Tyler. She shouldn't try anything as rash as that. It would do more harm than good, killing both friend and enemy, not to mention draining her of her ability to defend herself. So, instead of trying to do anything too crazy, Anwen followed the example of her caretakers. She took up shards of broken trees. She threw the transformed bits at whatever moved towards them in a threatening manner. Perhaps she should have begged to stay in the mountain, except she couldn't have sealed it from the inside. Tyler flew overhead. A revenant moved to intercept him, and pain flashed along Anwen's left leg, causing her to stumble. She felt a long line of fire erupt down its length before it went numb. Hopefully it didn't mean anything, though she suspected Tyler was now injured. She knew it wasn't from anything that had hit her. Her companions helped her back to her feet, and she moved to try and follow Tyler's course in the air. He was too busy to make mental contact with her, though part of her hoped he'd at least let her know he was okay. But she couldn't hang on to that thought long as a revenant burst in on their location.
Run!
One of the other mages yelled at Anwen as she tried to fight off the closest enemy. She heeded the advice, dashing for the nearest cover. The area she'd reached was unstable, and she plunged down an embankment, separating her from the others. Anwen landed with a jolt, all sound of the battle momentarily blocked from her ears as her mind tried to reboot. She didn't think she was hurt, though her legs shook as she tried to stand. Shadows blocked out the light from overhead. She ducked out of sight as more dragons converged on the redlands above her. She wasn't sure if any of them could see her from such a height or not. Part of her hoped they'd think her nothing more than a piece of nature as she tried to catch her breath. An explosion filled the air, leading her to believe Walter had to be somewhere nearby. He was the only one who brought that kind of weapon to the party. Chunks of earth flew up into the air and rained down around her. Perhaps he'd set up some kind of landmine while everyone was getting ready for the battle. If that were the case, she needed to be careful of her footing. More screams filled the air, coming so loud and thick that she couldn't help but duck down in fear. Tree branches rained down around her and she reached out with a mental hand. Her efforts created a sort of field of hardened air to ward off the debris. The foliage smacked into the condensed air and crashed to the ground around her. How on earth had her friends managed to survive fighting off the might of the Mage Circle without going mad? She couldn't help but wonder if it had been anything like what was going on now. Then it didn't matter what she thought as she came across another group of mages fighting off more of the enemy. Without thinking, she threw herself into the fray, praying she'd make it out of this encounter alive.